So I'm Julia. I'm contingent Prep 9, 33. So I'm in 11th grade. I'm from the Bronx, New York. I am currently in Andover, Massachusetts, because I go to Phillips Academy. And yeah, okay. Throughout the last few months, I have been researching the history of forced sterilization in the United States. I've gone through legislation back from the early 1900s, and I've read about the popular public opinions that followed this kind of American eugenics movement. I'll also talk about some like figures from popular institutions who endorsed sterilization, along with some of the more like surprisingly recent instances of this happening. Um, so could we actually go to like two slides over? Yeah. Yeah, great. So first, as Giselle was saying, this kind of all started with a book about it's titled The War on Puerto Rico, and it's about the Puerto Rican nationalist movement. And one of the things that they talked about in that book is the sterilization of women. So I wanted to talk about some stats that I came across about these Puerto Rican women in the 1950s. This was the time period that the nationalist movement was gaining traction and popularity, at least in Puerto Rico, because from the mainland US, it was definitely hated. Many white Americans viewed Puerto Ricans as dirty and disposable, and the numbers on the screen, the 25% increase in sterilization is not a coincidence to this time period. We'll see as a trend throughout this project and throughout American history, even outside of sterilization, that many women were had no idea what like the effects of the operation they were going through, what the long lasting effects were going to be, and the government and hospitals and just Americans in general really use sterilization as a way to silence certain communities. Yeah, so next slide, please. But 1950s, like 70 years ago, so it shouldn't matter anymore, right? And I feel like that is how a lot of history is viewed, just in general, because it's our past, and a lot of society doesn't think that our past influences us. But hopefully, in our history classes and our lives, we've all come across the fact that this is very untrue. And also, specifically with American women, forced sterilization isn't really our past. And what happened to those Puerto Rican women still happens in our country and is hardly noticed or reported on because it targets society's most dismissed group of people, which is almost always, especially in this situation, poor women of color. Next slide, please. The first state law regarding forced sterilization came from Indiana in 1907. It was approved by the Governor J. Frank Hanley, and it allowed certain prisoners to be legally sterilized without their consent. At this time, and really only this time, it actually typically targeted men, but that does not last. And at this time, many authoritative figures believed that certain behaviors were hereditary, such as criminal behavior. And they all figured that the best way to fix this issue and just social issues in general was to just deny criminals the ability to ever have children. The Indiana law was later deemed unconstitutional, but in its time, it sparked laws across the entire country that allowed the same things to happen. It sparked a movement of people who believe forced sterilizations could solve the country's social problems. And this quote comes from Charles William Eliot, who was the president of Harvard in the time where forced sterilization was gaining traction, kind of becoming popular. I got this quote from a Harvard article that talks about how influential Harvard was in the like just forced sterilization movement, which I was actually kind of surprised to figure out. But as you can see, he was an avid supporter of Indiana's law and clearly believed that the same logic should just be implemented throughout the entire country. He was not alone in this stance, and men with stances like Eliot believed that those who were so-called inferior should just not be allowed to pass their inferior genetics down to another generation. And in result, they all believed that the country just would be filled with perfection. And this was kind of quickly actually becoming public opinion. And in Oregon, similar law was passed in 1917 that permitted forced sterilization for those that were deemed feeble-minded, insane, epileptic, criminal, moral degenerates, or sexual perverts, all for the sake of public safety. When I came across the wording of that law, two things kind of came to my mind. One, how frequently that like pretty much the same argument is used in a lot of in current American politics, the idea that like we need to protect the women and the children, but most of the time the bills aren't really protecting anybody and just hurting the women and the children. Also how fluid one's interpretation of this bill could be, because while this law is no longer instated today, if it was 100 years later, our definitions of almost all of these words are completely different. This could have meant any disabled person. It could have meant any person who wasn't straight. It could have meant like just anybody who the country was biased against. And this applies to a lot of things outside of sterilization, but why leave somebody's autonomy up to how one perceives language? So next slide, please. This is kind of the big court case. This was a Supreme Court case that happened in 1927, when the issue was brought to the Supreme Court. Buck v. Bell was the Supreme Court case that challenged Virginia's Eugenical Sterilization Act of 1924. And that act allowed the forceful sterilization of people in the same, it was very much like Oregon and Indiana's law. It blocked feeble-mindedness, idiocy, and moral degeneracy. The woman that the state felt the need to sterilize was Carrie Buck. She was the first person to be involuntarily sterilized under this law, but definitely not the last. And everyone in the state believed that she and multiple generations of women before her were unfit for motherhood and therefore should be sterilized, which seems quite unfair. But they were deemed feeble-minded and promiscuous for having kids outside of being married, which also seems like a pretty big jump. But even worse, this whole case happened because Carrie Buck was raped by the nephew of the foster family she had been living with and then became pregnant. And I think that's probably one of the worst parts of this case, that the state's reaction to a woman being raped was like they wanted to recognize the fact that she probably shouldn't have kids rather than the crime that was just committed against her. And then the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state, in favor of the law, and against Carrie Buck. And it wasn't at all a controversial decision. It was an 8-1 vote. Not only that, but one of the justices on the court, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., noted that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. And that was kind of his reaction to the case. And definitely that opinion was shared by many Americans and clearly multiple people on the Supreme Court. And also, this case, Buck v. Bell, has never been overturned. Even after the Nazis cited this court case in their own defense during the Nuremberg trials, it still is not been overturned. But it's mostly become a state issue. I'm pretty sure all the states have repealed these forced sterilization laws and apologized to their victims, but forced sterilization continues to be legal on a federal level, which will later cause issues. Next slide, please. This is the Taft Supreme Court, the ones who made the Buck v. Bell decision. But I wanted to point out a not so fun fact and a little connection. This justice, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay. This justice is Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. He is the son of Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr., who is a friend of the Harvard president that we looked at the quote of earlier, Charles Eliot. Holmes Sr. was a very strong advocate for just eugenics in general. And like Charles Eliot believed that sterilization would help fix or totally fix the country's social issues. He really helped to like just grow the sport of eugenics in the US. But also he went to Phillips Academy, which is my school. And I just shocked to learn that the namesake of my library was somebody who like made this decision, or was the father of somebody who made the decision in the Supreme Court, and just a horrible man in general. Next slide. So is everyone good so far? Any questions? Okay, great. Much more recently than the 1920s. Oh, okay. Okay. A whistleblower from an LAUSC County Medical Center exposed the forced and illegal sterilizations of Mexican women in the 1970s. The report claimed that the hospital had been misleading women about a procedure and misleading them into giving consent for an operation that they did not fully understand because they were not fully informed. Some women didn't speak English. Some women were approached and coerced consent forms in exchange for painkillers or right after they had literally just given birth. And in 1978, this was brought to the state court in Madrigal v. QUILLIGAN. The court case was meant to answer if the hospital performed these procedures without consent, and if they had specifically targeted Mexican and Latino women. Personally, I guess I really shouldn't have been surprised about this, but I was once again surprised by the judge ruling in favor of the hospital. And even more so, he said that the issue was a communication error and not something the hospital should be legally punished for. And also that the woman's emotional responses to being sterilized was because of their culture's, because their culture valued being a mother and being able to raise children too much, rather than the fact that they had just been like denied their rights to their body. And even like if that were the issue or the case, the judge, that's not really the point of the case, and the judge really had no reason or right to bring that up or make that relevant. Next slide, please. This is another bill that happened in 2014 in California. So it happened again. This time it was incarcerated women that were targeted. And while doing my research, I came across one of the stories from these women. Dylan was serving a 15-year sentence in the Central California Women's Facility, which is a women's prison, for shooting and killing a husband that had been abusing her. In prison, she ended up with the doctor after saying that she had really bad cramps, and the doctor said that they needed to perform a hysterectomy to treat her apparent cervical cancer. But years later, she went to see another doctor, and this doctor informed Dylan that she never actually had cervical cancer, but she had been sterilized against her will because she didn't know what a hysterectomy did and was not informed, but she would never be able to have children again. And Dylan's story is far from the only one in this case. Dylan and her lawyer worked to pass this law on the screen, which bans forced sterilizations in prisons for the purpose of birth control, which happened to like thousands of women before this bill was passed. And I didn't really expect to find this in 2014, but I did. And part of the reason that this was able to happen to Dylan and like many, many other women is in part because Buck v. Bell was not overturned. Next slide, please. And just the last case, which happened 3 years ago in 2020, a whistleblower from a California ICE medical facility reported that a woman were being forcefully sterilized. This whistleblower was a nurse that recognized an oddly high number of hysterectomies, which is the same procedure that was done on Dylan, and is also a procedure that is primarily done, at least the nurse said, to sterilize somebody. This nurse, among other nurses, did not believe that these women fully understand what they were going through, what they were agreeing to, partially because in California at this time, there's like a specific procedure that like the doctors have to follow to get consent from their patients. And there's a waiting period between the time that you like there's multiple consent forms, and like you have to wait a certain amount of time between the consent forms. And like, it's not just like one consent form and then you're getting the procedure. It's like time passed, but California kind of, or this medical facility kind of just didn't care about that, and just went through with it anyway. And also some women did not speak English, but they were given English forms, so they wouldn't understand that, and also just like incorrectly informed their procedure and due to time, and also just like not enough information. And in her report, in the nurse's report, she even refers to the gynecologist who performed these hysterectomies as the uterus collector, which was, I don't know the emotion that was my reaction to that, but I'll say shock, because it was like a 19-page report, and that's how she referred to him for a couple times. And also, before I end, through all of these cases, first of all, a lot of the more recent ones, actually all the recent ones, have happened in California to Mexican, Latino, or Black women. But I say Mexican specifically because that was like most of the cases. And I brought this up at the beginning with Puerto Rican women, but I don't know if any of you knew about these cases, but I did not. A lot of my friends did not, and a lot of that is due to the fact that has not really been reported on. 2020 was 3 years ago, which is shocking to know that this happened 3 years ago, and definitely still happens today, because if it happened 3 years ago, it's probably still happening today. But I won't say nobody cares, but like the news doesn't care, and like general society hasn't put enough of value on women, immigrant women, and just poor women and poor women of color, just all the women. So it's not reported on and people don't know, which allows these things to keep happening. Yeah, so next slide. Thank you for listening. When I was starting this research, I wasn't really sure what I was going to come across. As Giselle was saying, Giselle and Dom were saying, this went a lot of different ways in the last couple of months. It started as a podcast. It also started as like specifically about Puerto Rico. Then it turned into like all the sterilization ever. But then I realized that was probably too wide of scope. But it turned into discovering specific court cases throughout American history having to do with sterilization in the US. And I'd say I was pretty shocked to see what I found, not only in like the horrifying history of it, but also in the connections to my school. So thank you everyone who helped me, Giselle, Dom, Mike, Isabel, just all of prep, and also my family. So thank you.